April 16, 1945, 03 a.m., Seelow Heights, Germany. The silence before dawn held more terror than any bombardment could deliver. The Oder River moved slowly in the pre-dawn darkness, its waters black and cold, reflecting nothing. Along its eastern bank, stretched across 25 miles of marshland and farmland, 2.5 million men waited. They did not sleep. They did not speak much. They smoked in cupped hands, checked their weapons for the 100th time, and thought about what the sunrise would bring. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood in his forward command post, a converted farmhouse 3 miles behind the front lines. Maps covered every surface. Maps marked with red arrows pointing west, always west, toward the prize that had consumed 4 years of blood and iron, Berlin. Zhukov was 58 years old, a peasant's son who had risen to command the greatest army ever assembled. His face was hard, weathered by 3 winters of war that had killed 27 million of his countrymen. He did not sleep either. Beside him, his artillery commanders presented their final calculations. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. 22,000 pieces of artillery, 9,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft, all aimed at a single objective, the German capital 40 miles to the west. The fascist beast is wounded, Zhukov told his officers, his voice carrying the weight of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Leningrad. But a wounded beast is the most dangerous. They will fight for every street, every building, every room. We will crush them with steel and fire. But Zhukov knew something his subordinates did not. Stalin had called him 2 nights before. The conversation had been brief and cold. Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front was positioned to the south, also aimed at Berlin. Stalin had set his 2 greatest commanders in a race. Whoever reached the Reichstag first would claim the glory. The cost in Soviet lives was irrelevant. 40 miles west, behind the Seelow Heights, a low ridge that rose barely 150 feet above the Oder floodplain, General Gotthard Heinrici surveyed a situation that could only be described as hopeless. Heinrici commanded Army Group Vistula, a grandiose name for what remained. Exhausted divisions, teenage boys in oversized uniforms, old men pulled from factory jobs, foreign volunteers who no longer believed in anything except survival. Heinrici was 60 years old, a career soldier who had learned his trade in the trenches of World War I. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had never joined the Nazi Party. He commanded respect not through ideology but through competence. His soldiers called him our poison dwarf, not from his height but from his ability to make the enemy pay dearly for every inch of ground. He had 100,000 men, perhaps 800 tanks, many immobilized from lack of fuel, artillery that was rationed to 10 shells per gun per day. And behind him, 20 miles away, lay Berlin, a city of 3 million civilians who had been told for months that the Soviets would never reach the capital. The lies had finally run out. Heinrici had deployed his men with the cunning of desperation. Soviet reconnaissance had spotted German positions along the Oder's western bank. What they had not spotted were the main defensive lines, pulled back behind the crest of the Seelow Heights, positioned where Soviet artillery would struggle to reach them. When the barrage came, and Heinrici knew it would be biblical, his forward trenches would be empty graves filled with sandbags and wooden silhouettes. In Berlin, in the Führer bunker 50 feet beneath the Reich chancellery, Adolf Hitler celebrated his 56th birthday. The party was subdued. The walls trembled from the concussion of Soviet artillery striking the city's eastern suburbs. Hitler's hands shook from Parkinson's disease. His left arm hung useless. His eyes, once capable of mesmerizing millions, now darted with paranoid fury. He spoke to his remaining staff about miracle weapons, about armies that existed only on paper, about betrayal and weakness. He insisted that the Soviet offensive would be crushed at the Oder, that Wehrmacht divisions would counterattack from the north and south, that the alliance between the Soviets and the Western Allies would collapse. No one believed him, but no one dared speak the truth. Outside the bunker, Berlin continued its macabre routine. Civilians queued for water from public pumps. Women traded family heirlooms for black market potatoes. Children played in bomb craters. The air smelled of brick dust, sewage from broken pipes, and the sweet, sick odor of bodies buried in rubble. Anti-aircraft guns still fired at Allied bombers. Hitler Youth prepared to defend the city with rifles, as tall as they were, and panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons that required a teenager to stand 15 feet from a T-34 tank to have any hope of destroying it. The city's defenses existed in theory. 3 defensive rings, anti-tank ditches, concrete fortifications, minefields. In reality, most of these were incomplete or constructed by forced laborers who sabotaged them when possible. The Volkssturm, the people's militia of boys and grandfathers, had been issued weapons but often lacked ammunition. Some units had 10 bullets per man. Others had none at all. SS and Gestapo units roamed the streets with orders to execute deserters. Lampposts and overpasses became gallows for soldiers whose only crime was acknowledging reality. Signs hung around their necks. I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland. In hospitals, doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. In orphanages, nuns fed children soup made from tulip bulbs. In the cellar shelters, families families huddled in darkness, listening to the eastern horizon growl with approaching thunder. Back at the Oder, Soviet soldiers prepared their final equipment. Assault engineers checked their explosive charges and flamethrowers. Tank crews loaded armor-piercing rounds and high-explosive shells. The artillery crews, the gods of war, made their final adjustments, calculating range and elevation for targets they could not see. Among the Soviet ranks were soldiers from every corner of the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks. Many had fought since 1941. They had survived encirclements, winter offensives, the meat grinder of urban combat. They had seen their villages burned, their families murdered or deported, their country ravaged from the Volga to the Vistula. Now they stood at the threshold of the beast's lair. For them, this was not just a military operation. This was reckoning. This was vengeance for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for the 27 million Soviet dead. Orders had been issued, officially and unofficially. Berlin was to be theirs. What they did with it was their business. Senior Lieutenant Grigory Zhukov, no relation to the famous general, stood with his rifle, company from the 8th Guards Army. He was 24 years old and had been fighting for 3 years. He carried photographs of his family in his breast pocket: a mother, father, and younger sister. He had not heard from them since 1942. Their village had been in the path of the German advance. He did not know if they were alive. He suspected they were not. "How long do you think until we're in Berlin?" a young private asked him. The boy was 18, newly arrived as a replacement. He had never been in combat. Zhukov looked west, toward the darkness where the German guns waited. "Depends on what? On how many of us are willing to die to get there." The private did not ask any more questions. At 03:00 a.m., Zhukov checked his watch one final time. He nodded to his artillery chief. The order passed down the chain of command through telephone lines and radio sets, reaching every gun crew along the front. At 03:01 a.m., searchlights blazed to life. 143 anti-aircraft searchlights, repositioned to aim horizontally across the battlefield. The darkness vanished, replaced by a blinding artificial dawn that illuminated the Oder River, the flooded marshland, and the Silo heights beyond. German soldiers, those few still manning forward positions, were caught in the glare like animals frozen on a midnight road. At 03:02 a.m., the world ended. The Soviet barrage that began at 03:02 on April 16, 1945, remains the largest artillery bombardment in human history. 22,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was not heard. It was felt, a physical force that rattled teeth and collapsed lungs, that shattered windows 40 miles away, that registered on seismographs in Sweden. For 30 minutes, the artillery fired at maximum rate. Shells fell like rain, high explosive, incendiary, smoke, fragmentation, creating a rolling curtain of fire and steel that moved slowly westward. The German forward positions, those few that were manned, simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Bunkers imploded. The earth itself seemed to liquefy under the impact. Then the guns shifted. For the next 2 hours, the barrage systematically worked through predetermined targets: command posts, supply depots, communication nodes, suspected artillery positions, reserve assembly areas. Soviet planners had divided the German defensive zone into squares, each 300 meters on a side. Each square received a calculated tonnage of high explosive. In the German positions behind the Silo heights, Heinrici's defensive gambit paid its first dividend. The vast majority of Soviet shells fell on empty ground or obliterated positions that had been abandoned the night before. But the sheer violence of the barrage still took its toll. Communication lines were severed. Observation posts were buried. Soldiers, even those in deep bunkers, emerged with bleeding ears and shattered nerves. At 05:30 a.m., the first wave of Soviet infantry moved forward. They crossed the Oder River on pontoon bridges that engineers had constructed under cover of darkness, rushing through the gaps torn in German wire obstacles by the barrage. The searchlights continued to blaze, illuminating their advance, a tactic that proved disastrous. Instead of blinding the Germans, the lights silhouetted the Soviet troops against the artificially lit terrain. German machine gunners, those who had survived the barrage, found their targets easily. The marshland along the Oder became a killing ground. Soviet soldiers waded through water up to their waists, holding their rifles above their heads, unable to take cover, unable to return fire effectively. German mortars and artillery, carefully positioned in defilade behind the heights, opened fire. Bodies floated in the flooded fields. The 8th Guards Army, Zhukov's unit among them, hit the marsh at 06:00 a.m. The water was ice cold, fed by snowmelt from the spring thaw. Zhukov felt it seep into his boots, his uniform, drawing the warmth from his body. Around him, men cursed and struggled forward. Machine gun fire cut through the reeds. A soldier 3 meters to his left jerked backward, his chest torn open. He fell face first into the water and did not rise. "Keep moving," officers shouted. "Forward, for the motherland!" But the advance stalled. The flooded terrain channeled the attacking force forces into narrow causeways and elevated ground that German gunners had registered weeks before. Casualties mounted. Companies that had begun the assault with 120 men were reduced to 60, 40, 20 within the first hour. Zhukov, watching from his command post, realized his carefully prepared plan was failing. The barrage had not destroyed the German defenses. The searchlights had not blinded them. The terrain itself was fighting against him. He made a decision that would define the entire battle. He committed his armor early. Tank armies, thousands of T-34s, chest-2 heavy tanks, and self-propelled guns were supposed to exploit the breakthrough once the infantry had seized the heights. Instead, Zhukov ordered them forward into the swamp. It was a calculated gamble born of desperation. Stalin was watching. Konev was racing toward Berlin from the south. There was no time for methodical, careful operations. The result was chaos. Tanks bogged down in the soft ground. Some sank to their turrets in mud and had to be abandoned. Others crowded onto the few passable roads, creating traffic jams that became targets for German artillery. Disabled tanks blocked the routes for those behind them. Infantry and armor, supposed to advance in coordination, became intermixed and tangled. By noon, after 9 hours of combat, Soviet forces had advanced less than 3 miles. They had not reached the main German defensive line. Casualties were mounting toward 30,000 killed and wounded. Zhukov's staff officers looked at the situation maps with poorly concealed alarm. Zhukov himself remained outwardly calm. He personally contacted army commanders demanding faster progress. He ordered fresh divisions forward. He authorized the commitment of additional artillery and air support. The pressure he placed on his subordinates was immense. The pressure Stalin placed on him was worse. In the German positions, Heinrici allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. His defensive scheme had worked. The Soviets were bleeding themselves against terrain in prepared positions. But he was also a realist. He had no reserves worth the name. Every hour of combat depleted his ammunition stocks. His men were exhausted before the battle even began. This was not victory. It was buying time, and time was the one commodity the Third Reich no longer possessed. By evening of April 16th, Soviet forces had finally reached the base of the Silo Heights. The actual ridge, the key terrain that dominated the entire battlefield, still lay ahead, bristling with German guns and defended by increasingly desperate soldiers. That night, Soviet medics worked under intermittent artillery fire, treating thousands of wounded. Bodies were collected from the marsh and stacked like cordwood for eventual burial. Tank crews labored to recover bogged vehicles. Infantry units that had been shattered in the day's fighting received replacements, often teenage boys who looked terrified in the flickering light of campfires. Zhukov had survived. His rifle company had not. Of the 80 men who had crossed the Oder that morning, 31 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. He sat in a shell crater, cleaning his rifle with numb fingers, too tired to eat the bread and tinned fish that had been distributed. The private who had asked him about Berlin that morning was dead. He had taken a mortar fragment to the throat and bled out in the marsh while Zhukov held him. The boy's last words had been for his mother. "Tomorrow we take the heights," a sergeant told the survivors. "Tomorrow we break through." Zhukov said nothing. He reloaded his rifle and tried not to think about what tomorrow would cost. 40 miles to the south, Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front launched its own assault. Unlike Zhukov, Konev had better terrain, rolling farmland instead of marsh, and he employed different tactics. His artillery used smoke shells to blind German observers rather than searchlights to illuminate Soviet troops. His advance was faster, less costly. Stalin noted the difference. He sent Konev a message. The boundary between the two fronts was now flexible. If Konev reached Berlin first, the glory would be his. The race had begun in earnest. Inside Berlin, the first refugees from the Oder front arrived with stories of the Soviet onslaught. The authorities dismissed them as defeatist propaganda and threatened arrest for spreading panic. But the civilians could hear the truth now. The constant rumble of artillery from the east, closer each day, like the footsteps of an approaching giant. Women began to understand what was coming. Soviet soldiers had committed widespread atrocities in East Prussia, in Pomerania, in Silesia. Rapes, murders, looting. Goebbels's propaganda had told the German people that Slavs were subhuman. Now those subhumans were coming with fire and vengeance, and the bill for 12 years of Nazi rule was about to come due in full. Some families made plans to flee west, toward the advancing Americans and British. Others prepared for suicide. Cyanide capsules, hoarded pills, pistols with a single bullet. A few prepared to resist. Most simply waited, trapped between the Soviet hammer and the collapsing Nazi anvil, with nowhere to go and nothing left but hope that somehow, impossibly, they might survive what was coming. In the Führer bunker, Hitler raged at reports of the battle. He blamed Heinrici for cowardice, blamed the troops for weakness, blamed his generals for treason. He ordered counterattacks by divisions that existed only as names on situation maps. He forbade forbade any retreat. Berlin would be defended. The Reich would triumph. The will would overcome reality. His staff exchanged glances but said nothing. Some were already planning their escapes. Others were preparing to die with the regime they had served. All of them knew the truth. The war was lost. It had been lost for months, perhaps years. All that remained was the accounting of the cost, and the cost would be catastrophic. April 17, 1945, 06 a.m., Silo Heights. The ridge was not tall, but it was soaked in blood. The second day's assault began with another massive artillery barrage, shorter but more concentrated. Soviet guns hammered the heights for 40 minutes while ground attack aircraft, Sturmovix, circled overhead like hungry vultures, waiting for the signal to strike. At 06:40, the infantry went forward again. This time they attacked up the slopes of the heights themselves, climbing through churned earth and splintered trees. German defenders, now fully committed to their main defensive line, poured fire down on them. Machine guns cut enfilade lanes across the hillside. Mortars dropped shells into Soviet assembly areas. The killing was methodical and efficient. Zhukov's company attacked as part of the 8th Guards Army's renewed push. They moved in small groups using shell craters and destroyed vehicles for cover, advancing in bounds. Every 10 meters gained cost lives. A young replacement stumbled and fell, shot through the head. An officer stood to rally his men and was cut down by a burst of machine gun fire. Wounded men crawled backward, leaving trails of blood in the mud. But the Soviets had one overwhelming advantage: numbers. When a company was destroyed, another took its place. When a battalion was shattered, 2 more moved forward. The weight of mass, the simple calculus of attrition, began to tell. German positions that could massacre one assault company found themselves attacked from 3 sides by the next wave. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red, until their ammunition ran out, until Soviet infantrymen appeared in their trenches with bayonets and grenades. By midday, Soviet forces had pushed halfway up the heights. The battle devolved into vicious close combat, room-to-room clearing of German bunkers, hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, flamethrowers burning defenders alive in their positions. The smell of cordite mixed with burning flesh. Wounded men from both sides crawled through the battle, trying to find safety that didn't exist. German counterattacks came sporadically. A platoon of Hitler Youth, led by a fanatical SS officer, charged with panzerfausts and managed to destroy 3 Soviet tanks before being annihilated. A group of Volkssturm veterans held a village for 4 hours, killing over 100 Soviet soldiers before a direct hit from a Stalin tank collapsed the building they were defending. The Germans were dying for time, for meters, for minutes. They all knew the outcome was inevitable, but they fought anyway, from fear of what Soviet capture would mean, from loyalty to comrades beside them, from the simple soldier's instinct to survive 1 more minute, 1 more hour. By evening of April 17th, Soviet forces controlled most of the Silo Heights. The cost had been staggering, over 40,000 casualties in 2 days for an advance of 6 miles, but the breakthrough was finally at hand. The German main defensive line was shattered. Between the Oder and Berlin, only exhausted remnants and improvised battle groups stood in the way. Heinrici, observing the collapse of his carefully prepared defenses, requested permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal toward Berlin, preserving his remaining forces for the defense of the capital. Hitler refused. Every position was to be held to the last man. Retreat was forbidden. Those who fell back would be shot as traitors. Heinrici ignored the order. He was not a Nazi, not a fanatic. He was a professional soldier who understood that sacrificing his remaining troops in futile last stands would only ease the Soviet advance. Under cover of darkness on April 17th, he ordered a general retreat toward the next defensive line, 10 miles closer to Berlin. His officers passed the orders verbally, avoiding radio communications that might be intercepted. Units disengaged under cover of rearguards and fell back through the night. Hitler, informed of the retreat by Heinrici's rivals, flew into a rage. He dismissed Heinrici from command and ordered his arrest. But by then, it no longer mattered. The German army was no longer a cohesive force following orders from Berlin. It was a dying animal, fighting on instinct, each component acting independently to survive just a few hours longer. April 18th began with Soviet tanks pouring through the gaps in the German lines. The breakthrough had finally come. Tank armies fanned out, racing west, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, creating chaos in the German rear. Infantry followed in trucks, half-racks, and on foot, mopping up resistance, accepting surrenders from soldiers who simply had no fight left. The Soviet advance was no longer a carefully orchestrated operation. It was a flood, uncontrolled and violent. Units raced each other toward Berlin. Officers lost contact with higher headquarters and made their own decisions. The goal was clear, the capital. The methods were improvised. German resistance became fragmented. A group of paratroopers would defend a crossroads for a day, destroying a dozen tanks, then be overrun. A battalion of police troops would hold a town long enough for refugees to evacuate, then fade into the countryside. Isolated units fought to the death, not because they believed in victory, but because surrender to the Soviets meant almost certain death anyway. The civilians caught in this zone of chaos suffered terribly. Villages were fought over, looted, burned. Women who had survived the German occupation of Soviet territory now found themselves at the mercy of Soviet soldiers who remembered what had been done to their own families. The cycle of vengeance played out in uncounted atrocities, each side justifying brutality with the brutality inflicted upon them. By April 19th, Soviet forces were 20 miles from Berlin. The city's eastern suburbs were within artillery range. The first shells began falling on residential neighborhoods. Berlin's civilians, who had endured years of Allied bombing, now faced a new terror, ground combat approaching their streets. In the Führer bunker, Hitler finally acknowledged reality. He would not leave Berlin. He would command the defense of the capital personally. The city would be held block by block, building by building, room by room. Germany's enemies wanted total victory. They would pay for it in blood and rubble. Orders went out to demolish bridges, flood the subway tunnels, prepare every building as a fortress. The Volkssturm received rifles dragged from museums and warehouses. Hitler Youth were armed with panzerfausts and told they were the last hope of the Reich. SS units moved into position to prevent civilian evacuation and to execute anyone who spoke of surrender. The citizens of Berlin, 2.5 million people, found themselves trapped in a city about to become a battlefield. The government that had promised them empire and glory now demanded they die in its defense. Outside the city, Soviet commanders issued their final orders for the assault. Berlin was divided into sectors, each assigned to a specific army. The city would be encircled, then crushed. The advance would begin on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. Stalin insisted on it. The timing was symbolic, a final insult to the enemy. On the night of April 19th, Zhukov sat with the remnants of his company in the ruins of a German village 12 miles from Berlin. They had been reinforced twice since crossing the Oder. Of the original 80 men, only 6 remained. The rest were replacements, boys and exhausted veterans transferred from other shattered units. They could see the glow of fires on the western horizon, Berlin burning from artillery and airstrikes. They could hear the distant rumble of explosions. Tomorrow, a veteran sergeant said, "We'll be in the city." Zhukov nodded. He had fought in Stalingrad, in the ruins of that city where every building was a fortress and every street was a grave. He knew what urban combat meant. He knew what the next weeks would cost. "Get some sleep," he told his men. Tomorrow will be long, but none of them slept. They sat in the darkness, smoking, checking weapons, thinking about home or not thinking at all. The wind carried ash from the burning city. Somewhere in the distance, a German soldier was singing, a melancholy song about homeland and loss. Then the artillery started up again, and the singing stopped. April 20th, 1945, 6:00 a.m., Berlin's eastern suburbs. The beast's lair had no doors left to guard. The Soviet assault on Berlin began with a coordinated push from 3 directions. Zhukov's forces from the northeast, Konev's from the southeast, and Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front from the north. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers began moving toward the city. Supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, Berlin's outer defensive ring was supposed to be a formidable obstacle: anti-tank ditches, concrete fortifications, interlocking fields of fire. In reality, much of it was incomplete or poorly manned. Where defenses existed, they were often held by teenage Hitler Youth or elderly Volkssturm who barely knew how to load their weapons. The first Soviet troops entered the suburbs at mid-morning. They advanced cautiously, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found abandoned streets, civilians waving white sheets from windows, and scattered groups of German soldiers who surrendered immediately. But in other sectors, the fighting was immediately ferocious. SS units and Wehrmacht veterans created strong points in apartment buildings and factory complexes. They allowed Soviet tanks to pass, then attacked the following infantry from concealed positions. Soviet soldiers would clear a building only to face fire from cellars or sewers they hadn't checked. A city block could take hours to secure, then be contested again from positions behind the Soviet advance. Zhukov's company entered Berlin through the district of Marzahn on April 20th. The street fighting was unlike anything he had experienced even at Stalingrad. The Germans were using the city itself as a weapon. They demolished buildings to create roadblocks. They flooded basements to prevent Soviet use of underground passages. They positioned snipers in church steeples and machine guns in second-story windows overlooking crossroads. His company's first casualty came from a sniper no one ever saw. A replacement soldier in Berlin less than an hour simply fell with a hole through his forehead. The others scattered for cover, pressing themselves against walls, diving into doorways. Where did it come from? Someone shouted. No one knew. The shot could have come from any of 100 windows. They couldn't advance without exposing themselves. They couldn't retreat. They were pinned. A sergeant pulled out a signal flare and fired it. Minutes later, a Stalin tank rumbled up the street. It rotated its turret and fired into the building where the sniper was suspected to be hiding. The 120mm shell detonated inside the structure. The entire facade collapsed in a cloud of brick dust and smoke. Whether the sniper died was unknown. The company moved forward. This became the pattern: slow, brutal, costly. Soviet forces used overwhelming firepower to compensate for the advantages defenders held in urban terrain. A suspected German position would be hit with artillery, tank fire, and sometimes flamethrower flamethrowers before infantry moved in. Entire buildings were demolished to eliminate single machine gun nests. The destruction was immense. The city was being leveled street by street. German defenders learned quickly. They operated in small groups, fighting from one position then falling back through cellars and tunnels before Soviet artillery could respond. They used the panzerfaust with devastating effect. Teenage boys would wait in rubble until a Soviet tank came within 20 meters, then fire and flee. Soviet tankers who had survived 3 years of warfare died in Berlin's streets at the hands of children. The SS operated mobile execution squads, hanging soldiers and civilians alike for defeatism. Bodies swung from lampposts with signs, "I was too cowardly to fight," or "I betrayed the Führer," but this terror proved counterproductive. Soldiers who might have retreated in good order now fought to the death rather than risk capture by their own side. By April 22nd, Soviet forces had fought through the outer suburbs and reached the inner defensive ring, the S-Bahn rail line that encircled central Berlin. This was where the real city defense began. The buildings were denser, the streets narrower, the defenders more fanatical. The battle for the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of German power, was still weeks away, but the battle for Berlin was reaching its crescendo. Both sides were exhausted. Soviet logistics struggled to keep ammunition and food flowing forward through the devastated suburbs. German defenders were running out of everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, hope. In the Führer bunker, Hitler was increasingly detached from reality. He issued orders for counterattacks by divisions that had ceased to exist. He moved phantom armies on his maps. He insisted that relief forces were approaching from the south and west, forces that would break the Soviet encirclement and turn the tide of battle. His staff knew better. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, the Wehrmacht's chief adjutant, was drinking himself into oblivion. Joseph Goebbels moved his entire family into the bunker, preparing for a Wagnerian final act. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, insisted on staying with him, refusing all evacuation offers. Above them, Berlin died. The civilian population huddled in cellars as the battle raged overhead. Water supplies failed. Power grids collapsed. Food was scarce. Medical care was non-existent. Women faced constant threat of rape from Soviet soldiers who viewed Berlin's population as complicit in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Soviet commanders were under immense pressure to finish the battle quickly. Stalin demanded daily updates. The cost in Soviet lives was secondary to the political imperative of capturing Berlin before the Western Allies. Units were pushed forward even when exhausted. Tank crews who had fought for days without rest were ordered into new assaults. Casualty figures became abstractions, numbers on situation reports that no longer shocked or troubled the generals. On April 23rd, a critical turning point came. Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was cut off. No supplies could enter. No reinforcements could arrive. The German defenders and 3 million civilians were trapped in a shrinking pocket. Heinrici, who had been officially dismissed but was still trying to organize defensive operations outside the city, pleaded with Hitler to allow the civilian evacuation. Hitler refused. The civilians were to be armed and used in the defense. Every Berliner was a soldier. The city would fight to the last person. The truth was different. Most Berliners simply wanted to survive. They hid from both the German military police and the approaching Soviets. They traded jewelry for moldy bread. They carried buckets of water from bomb crater puddles. They cared nothing for ideology or victory. They wanted only to see tomorrow. Inside the shrinking defensive perimeter, German military cohesion finally collapsed. Units disintegrated. Officers lost contact with their commands. Soldiers deserted, hiding in cellars or trying to flee west toward American lines. The Hitler youth, indoctrinated and fanatical, fought on. So did the SS, who knew they faced certain death if captured. But the ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, the veterans who had fought since Poland or France, increasingly simply gave up. Soviet forces pressed inward from all directions. The German-held territory shrank daily. The Tiergarten, Berlin's central parks, became a battleground. Government ministries became fortresses. The zoo became a charnel house when artillery fire killed the exotic animals, leaving elephants and giraffes dead among the ruins. Zhukov's company fought there, way to within 3 kilometers of the city center by April 25th. Of the 6 original members who had survived to reach Berlin, 2 remained. Zhukov was one. The other was a Ukrainian machine gunner named Petrov, who spoke little and smiled never. They had been reinforced 4 times. The current iteration of their company numbered 35 men, almost none of whom had been with the unit more than a week. They were all veterans now, not of the war, but of Berlin. The city had a way of turning boys into exhausted old men within days. Their current objective was an apartment block that German observers were using to direct artillery. The building was 4 stories, concrete and brick, windows blown out by previous shelling. Intelligence said it was defended by SS troops. They attacked at dawn on April 26th. A flamethrower team went first, hosing the ground floor with liquid fire. The screaming started immediately. Soviet infantry rushed through the smoke and flames, firing as they went. Germans fired back from upper floors. Grenades arced through the air. A Soviet soldier fell backward, his face gone. Another kept running despite blood pouring from his leg. Zhukov fought up the stairwell, rifle at his shoulder, advancing one step at a time. A German appeared on the landing above. Not SS, just a Wehrmacht soldier who looked barely 18. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Zhukov fired first. The German crumpled. The building was cleared in 20 minutes. 8 Germans killed, 3 captured. Soviet casualties, 6 dead, 9 wounded. The captured Germans were teenagers, boys in oversized uniforms who trembled and cried. One asked through a translator if they would be shot. Zhukov looked at them and felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, just exhaustion. Take them to the rear, he told the guards. He didn't know what would happen to them there. He didn't care. He just wanted this day to end, and the next day, and however many days remained until this nightmare was over. But the nightmare was only beginning. The street fighting was getting worse as they pushed deeper into the city. Every building was a bunker. Every intersection was a kill zone. The Germans were down to their last reserves, but those reserves were the most fanatical. SS, Hitler Youth, true believers who would rather die than surrender, and they were dying. By the thousands, in the rubble of their capital under the ruins of their 1,000-year Reich. But they were taking Soviet soldiers with them. The victory was becoming a slaughter for both sides. By April 27th, Soviet forces were within a kilometer of the Führer bunker, though they didn't know it. The bunker's location was a carefully guarded secret, but it didn't matter. They were crushing the pocket methodically, building by building, room by room, body by body. The Reichstag, the massive parliament building that had stood since the 19th century, was now within sight of Soviet forward units. Zhukov designated it as the symbolic target. Whoever planted the Soviet flag on its dome would be immortalized. The race within the race intensified. Regiments competed for the honor. Soldiers pushed themselves beyond exhaustion for a chance at glory. But between the Soviet lines and the Reichstag lay the most defended square kilometer in Berlin, the government quarter. The Reich Chancellery, the Brandenburg Gate, the ministries and official buildings, all converted into fortresses. Here the SS had concentrated their remaining strength. Here the defenses were multi-layered, interlocking. Deadly, April 28, 1945, the Moltke Bridge. The bridge crossing the Spree River toward the government quarter became one of the war's final focal points. German engineers had prepared it for demolition, but lacked the explosives to destroy it completely. Now it was defended by a mixed force. SS veterans, Hitler Youth, some Navy personnel who had been formed into an improvised infantry battalion. Soviet forces needed the bridge. Their assault began at 14 following a 15-minute artillery barrage that reduced the surrounding buildings to skeletal frames. The first wave, assault troops from the 3rd Shock Army, rushed across under covering fire from tanks positioned on the eastern bank. The Germans opened fire from prepared positions on the western side. Machine guns swept the bridge. Mortars dropped shells into the packed Soviet infantry. Bodies fell into the Spree, the water turning red. But more Soviets came, and more. They couldn't all be killed. A group of Hitler Youth, positioned in a bunker at the bridge's western end, fired their panzerfausts at nearly point-blank range, destroying 2 Soviet tanks that had managed to cross. The knocked-out vehicles blocked the bridge, creating an obstacle that slowed the assault. For 2 hours, the bridge was a no-man's land of wrecked armor and dead soldiers. Then Soviet engineers brought up explosives and blew the wrecked tanks off the bridge with demolition charges. Fresh assault troops moved across at 16:30, covered by smoke shells. This time they reached the western bank and fought their way into the defensive positions. The battle became hand-to-hand. Bayonets, entrenching tools, pistols at close range, raw brutality. The Hitler Youth who had destroyed the tanks fought to the last. They were 15, 16, 17 years old. They died in their bunker when a Soviet soldier rolled grenades through the firing slit. Their last words, according to the Soviet soldier who killed them, were prayers and calls for mothers who weren't coming. By evening on April 28th, Soviet forces had crossed the Spree in force and were pushing toward the Reichstag. The building was less than 500 meters from Hitler's bunker, though neither side knew exactly how close they were to their respective objectives. In the Führer bunker, the end was palpably near. Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony on April 29th. There was cake. There was forced joviality. Outside, the bunker's walls trembled from the impact of shells and bombs. Dust filtered down from the concrete ceiling. The electric lights flickered. Hitler dictated his political testament, blaming the Jews for the war, blaming the German people for their weakness, blaming everyone but himself. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, a choice that baffled his remaining staff since Dönitz was with the northern forces, far from Berlin. Goebbels sat with his 6 children in their bunker quarters. His wife Magda had already prepared the cyanide capsules. They would not allow their children to live in a world without National Socialism. The decision had been made. The children played with toys, unaware that their parents were planning their murders. Above the bunker, the city had become hell. Fires raged unchecked. The smell of death was everywhere. Decaying bodies buried in rubble. The stench of sewage from broken pipes. The acrid smoke of burning buildings. Civilians Civilians emerged from shelters to find their neighborhoods unrecognizable, transformed into lunar landscapes of craters and debris. Soviet soldiers, having fought for weeks through this nightmare, were at the breaking point. Combat effectiveness declined as exhaustion, trauma, and rage took their toll. Discipline broke down. Looting was universal. Rape was epidemic. Officers who tried to maintain order were often ignored or threatened. The army that had survived the Great Patriotic War was consuming itself in victory, but the final objective remained. The Reichstag, April 30th, 1945, 0600 am, the Königsplatz, Berlin. The last fortress stood wrapped in smoke, its stones soaked in the blood of a dying regime. The Reichstag was a ruin even before the final assault. Allied bombing and Soviet artillery had blown out its windows, collapsed sections of its roof, and pockmarked its stone facade with shell impacts. But it remained standing and massive, defiant, a symbol that needed to be torn down. The building was defended by approximately 5,000 German troops, SS units, naval personnel, police battalions, and some Wehrmacht remnants. They had fortified it for weeks, turning it into a citadel. Machine gun nests covered every approach. The cellars were packed with ammunition. The upper floors provided perfect firing positions overlooking the approaches. The Soviet assault began at dawn. The 150th Rifle Division and the 171st Rifle Division, both from the 3rd Shock Army, were given the honor of taking the building. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, covered by direct fire from tanks and assault guns positioned 100 meters away. The first wave was cut down. Machine gun fire from the Reichstag's windows swept the plaza. Soviet soldiers fell in clusters, bodies piling upon bodies. Those who reached the building's exterior walls found themselves pinned, unable to advance or retreat, taking casualties from grenades dropped from upper floors. But Soviet tactics had evolved through years of urban combat. Assault groups, small units with specific roles, began working systematically. Flamethrower teams burned out ground floor positions. Sapper teams blew holes in walls for entry points. Snipers picked off German gunners. Heavy machine guns suppressed upper floor defenders while assault troops moved forward. Zhukov's company was not part of the Reichstag assault. They were fighting 2 blocks away, clearing an SS strongpoint in the Ministry of the Interior. But they could hear the battle, the intensity of fire that meant something significant was happening. By mid-morning, Soviet troops had fought their way inside the Reichstag. But taking the building was different from taking a position inside it. The structure was a maze. Hallways, rooms, stairwells, all of it contested. German defenders fell back from position to position, making the Soviets pay for every meter. The fighting inside was primordial. Too close for rifles often. Soldiers used pistols, knives, fists, anything. A German officer shot 3 Soviet soldiers with his Luger before being killed with an entrenching tool. A Soviet sergeant was blown apart by a grenade he couldn't throw back in time. The marble halls, once walked by diplomats and politicians, became abattoirs. At 14:25 on April 30th, 2 Soviet soldiers, Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Melton Kantaria, fought their way to the Reichstag's roof. They carried a Soviet flag, hastily made, red cloth with hammer and sickle stitched in gold. Under heavy fire from German positions in nearby buildings, they raised the flag and secured it to a sculptural element on the building's dome. The photograph that would become iconic was actually staged 3 days later with different soldiers, better lighting, and a more dramatic flag position. But the moment itself was real. At 14:25 on April 30th, 1945, the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. The battle wasn't over. German defenders continued fighting inside the building for another 2 days. But symbolically, psychologically, the moment was decisive. Berlin had fallen. 15 minutes later, at 14:40, in the Führer bunker 300 meters away, Adolf Hitler put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Eva Braun, sitting beside him on the couch, had taken cyanide seconds before. Their bodies were carried upstairs to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The flames burned for hours, consuming the man who had consumed Europe. Goebbels learned of Hitler's death within the hour. That evening, on May the 1st, after several attempts to negotiate with the Soviets had failed, he and his wife Magda went to their children's room. The children, 6 of them aged 4 to 12, were given hot chocolate mixed with sedatives. Once they were unconscious, Magda crushed cyanide capsules into their mouths. All 6 children died within minutes. Then Goebbels and his wife went upstairs to the garden. An SS guard shot them both in the back of the head at their request. Their bodies were burned like Hitler's, though less thoroughly. The death throes of the Third Reich played out in scattered actions across the city. Some units fought on, unaware that Hitler was dead or refusing to believe it. Others surrendered en masse. Thousands of German soldiers tried to break out westward, toward American lines, through the Soviet encirclement. Most were killed or captured. A few made it. On May 2nd, 1945, at 06 Uhr, General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of the Berlin Defense defense area surrendered the city. He appeared at Soviet headquarters and formally capitulated, ordering all remaining German forces to cease resistance. The order was broadcast repeatedly over radio and through loudspeakers. Gradually, in sectors across the city, the shooting stopped. The silence was almost as shocking as the battle had been. Soldiers who had lived with constant noise for weeks found the quiet disorienting. Some wept. Others simply sat down where they were, too exhausted to feel anything. Zhukov survived. On May 2nd, his company, 9 men from an original 80, was clearing a building in the Tiergarten when they heard the surrender order. They stopped mid-assault, weapons still raised, staring at each other in disbelief. "It's over?" the Ukrainian machine gunner Petrov asked. Zhukov nodded slowly. "It's over." They sat down in the rubble and no one spoke. Around them, Berlin burned. Bodies lay in streets, in buildings, in bomb craters. The city was a corpse, 3 million civilians trapped inside, hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead or dying, infrastructure destroyed, a civilization erased. Petrov pulled out a photograph, his family taken before the war, his wife and 2 daughters. He had not heard from them since 1942. Their village had been in occupied territory. He did not know if they were alive. He looked at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully put it back in his pocket. "Now what?" he asked. Zhukov had no answer. Victory felt nothing like he had imagined. He felt no joy, no triumph, only exhaustion and a vast, hollowing emptiness. He had survived. So many had not. What did that mean? What had any of it meant? Soviet forces poured into Berlin center. The victory was theirs, undeniable and total. But the cost had been catastrophic. Soviet casualties for the Berlin operation totaled approximately 80,000 killed and 280,000 wounded. German military casualties were similar, around 92,000 killed and 220,000 captured. Civilian deaths numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 130,000, many from artillery and airstrikes, others from Soviet atrocities, some from suicide. The streets were clogged with destroyed vehicles, over 2,000 Soviet tanks lost, countless German vehicles. Buildings smoldered, the Spree River was choked with debris and bodies. The air was thick with ash and the smell of death. Soviet soldiers celebrated their victory in the ways soldiers do, drinking looted alcohol, singing, firing weapons into the air. But beneath the celebration was trauma. These men had seen and done things that would haunt them forever. They had witnessed the worst of humanity and participated in it. The psychological scars would never heal. For Berlin civilians, the battle's end brought no relief, only a different kind of nightmare. Soviet occupation was brutal. Systematic rape of German women continued for weeks. Looting stripped the city of anything valuable. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent, law and order absent. Thousands died in the weeks after the battle from starvation, disease, and violence. The Western Allies, who had stopped their advance to allow the Soviets to take Berlin, were horrified by reports of what was happening. But Stalin had claimed his prize. The city would be divided into occupation zones, the country split. The Cold War's lines drawn across Berlin's broken streets. In the Reichstag, Soviet soldiers carved their names into the walls, thousands of names, scratched with knives and bayonets into the marble and plaster. Names of men who had survived the impossible, who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, who wanted to be remembered. Among those names, carved into a second-floor corridor, was a simple inscription: "We came from Moscow. We will never forget." Elsewhere in Berlin, a German woman sat in the ruins of what had been her home. She was 35 years old. Her husband had died on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her son had been killed defending Berlin. 17 years old, shot while carrying a panzerfaust he barely knew how to use. Her daughter was in a field hospital, having been raped by Soviet soldiers and beaten when she resisted. She sat in the rubble and stared at nothing. Everything she had known was gone. The government that had promised glory had delivered ash. The ideology that had promised empire had brought destruction. The Führer who had promised victory had died a coward's death in a bunker, and now the survivors had to find a way to live with what had been done, what they had allowed to be done, what had been done to them. The war in Europe would officially end on May 8th, when Germany signed the final unconditional surrender. But for Berlin, the war ended on May 2nd in smoke and blood and silence. The battle for Berlin killed approximately 400,000 people, soldiers and civilians combined. It destroyed a city that had stood for 800 years. It marked the final collapse of the Third Reich, a regime that had promised to last 1,000 years and barely managed 12. But more than that, it represented something darker about human nature. What happens when ideology replaces reason, when hate becomes policy, when war becomes total? The ruins of Berlin were not just the ruins of buildings and bridges. They were the ruins of civilization itself, torn down by humans who had forgotten they were human. May 3rd, 1945, 08 a.m., Central Berlin. Victory tastes like ash when you swallow it in a graveyard. The sun rose over Berlin on May 3rd, but it could barely penetrate the smoke that hung over the city. The fires still burned. Some would burn for weeks, fed by broken gas gas mains and the debris of destroyed buildings. The smoke rose in columns across the city, visible from miles away. Monuments to destruction. Soviet soldiers no longer fighting faced the reality of what they had won. Berlin was a city of 3 million people, most of whom were now the responsibility of an occupying army that had no supplies to feed them, no intact infrastructure to sustain them, and no particular desire to help them. The humanitarian crisis was immediate and overwhelming. Water distribution points were mobbed by desperate civilians. Food was almost non-existent. Berlin's food stocks had been consumed or destroyed during the battle. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers and civilians, operating without electricity, without clean water, without adequate supplies. Soviet military authorities established control gradually. Curfews were implemented. Looters, both Soviet soldiers and German civilians, were occasionally shot, though enforcement was sporadic. Work details were organized to clear streets, recover bodies, and restore basic services. The body recovery operation was particularly grim. Tens of thousands of corpses lay in the open, soldiers from both sides, civilians killed in crossfire or airstrikes, victims of atrocities. They had to be collected, identified when possible, and buried in mass graves. The work was assigned to German POWs and civilian labor battalions. It took months. Zhukov's unit was pulled back from the front lines and assigned to garrison duty. After weeks of combat, the transition to occupation was jarring. They were billeted in a relatively intact apartment building in Charlottenburg. The residents had been evicted and were living in cellars or with relatives. Soviet soldiers moved into their homes, slept in their beds, used their possessions. The moral complexity of the situation was inescapable. These civilians had supported the Nazi regime, had cheered when Wehrmacht tanks rolled through Paris and when Luftwaffe bombers struck London. Many had sons and husbands who had participated in the atrocities on Soviet soil. Did they deserve sympathy? Did they deserve revenge? Did the answer even matter anymore? Zhukov didn't think about it much. He was too tired. He slept for nearly 18 hours after the surrender, a dreamless sleep born of total exhaustion. When he woke, he felt no better. The fatigue went deeper than rest could cure. He wrote a letter to his family in the village near Kursk, a letter that might or might not reach them, that might or might not be read by people who might or might not still be alive. He told them he had survived. He told them the war was over. He did not tell them what he had seen or done. Some things could not be written. Some things could not be spoken. Around him, other soldiers dealt with victory in their own ways. Some drank themselves unconscious. Others sought out German women, sometimes consensually, often not. Some sat silently, staring at nothing, processing trauma that would never fully heal. A few committed suicide, unable to transition from the adrenaline of combat to the hollow reality of peace. The officers tried to restore discipline with limited success. Orders were issued forbidding fraternization with German civilians, prohibiting looting, requiring proper conduct. The orders were largely ignored. The army that had fought its way from Stalingrad to Berlin was not an army anymore. It was 2 million exhausted, traumatized men who had survived hell and no longer cared much about regulations. Stalin visited Berlin briefly in late May, touring the ruins with his entourage. Photographs were taken. Speeches were made. He visited the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery, viewing the bunker where Hitler had died. He expressed satisfaction. Berlin was Soviet. Germany was crushed. The Great Patriotic War was won, but the cost was only beginning to be calculated. 27 million Soviet citizens dead, cities destroyed, entire regions depopulated, the agricultural heartland devastated, an entire generation of young men killed or maimed. The Soviet Union had won, but it had also been gutted, and in Berlin, the survivors tried to rebuild something from nothing. German women formed rubble women brigades, clearing debris by hand, salvaging bricks, slowly reclaiming their city from destruction. Children played in the ruins, finding war trophies and unexploded ordnance that occasionally killed them. Old men stood in soup lines trying to feed families on rations that were barely sufficient for survival. The division of Germany was formalized in the Potsdam Conference in July. Berlin would be divided into 4 sectors: Soviet, American, British, and French. The city that had been united in destruction would be divided in occupation. The seeds of the Cold War were planted in the ruins of the Third Reich. For Zhukov, the orders to return home came in September 1945. He had survived combat from Kursk to Berlin, had lived through battles that killed hundreds of thousands, had become one of the statistical miracles, a Soviet soldier who saw the entire war and lived to see peace. Before leaving Berlin, he walked one last time through the ruins of the city. He passed the Reichstag, still bearing Soviet slogans and graffiti. He passed through the Tiergarten, where German and Soviet bodies had been buried in mass graves marked only with numbers. He passed buildings where his friends had died, streets he had fought for meter by meter. He felt nothing, no pride, no satisfaction, just a vast emptiness where emotions should have been. At the train station waiting for transport east, he met Petrov one last time. The Ukrainian machine gunner was also going home. They shared a cigarette in silence, 2 men who had survived the same nightmare but had no words to describe it. "What will you do?" Petrov asked. Zhukov shrugged. "Try to forget." Petrov nodded. I don't think we can. He was right. The veterans of the Eastern Front carried their trauma back to their villages and cities. Many could not readjust. Suicide rates were high. Alcoholism was epidemic. Domestic violence plagued families. The Soviet state, which had demanded everything from these men, provided almost nothing for their recovery. They had served their purpose. Now they were expected to simply continue. In Germany, the process of confronting what had been done was even more complex. Many Germans claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, of the atrocities of the war crimes. They focused on their own suffering. The bombing, the battle, the occupation. The moral reckoning with National Socialism would take decades and would never be complete. Berlin itself became a symbol of the divided world. The Iron Curtain literally split the city. Families were separated. The wall would eventually rise. The city that Hitler had wanted to remake as Germania, capital of a 1,000-year empire, became instead a monument to his failure and to the cost of that failure. The Reichstag remained a ruin until the 1960s. Soviet soldiers' graffiti was preserved under later renovations. Names and messages carved by men who wanted to be remembered, who wanted proof that they had been there, that they had survived, that they had mattered. In 1999, the restored Reichstag became the seat of the reunified German parliament. Modern Germany built a glass dome atop the building, transparent, open, democratic, a deliberate contrast to the darkness that had once ruled from that place. But if you go there today into the building's interior, you can still find the old graffiti in preserved sections. Names in Cyrillic, dates, simple statements. We came from Moscow. Victory. Never again. The men who carved those messages are mostly gone now. The last veterans of the Battle of Berlin are in their late 90s or have already passed. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it was actually like. The sound, the smell, the fear, the exhaustion. The moment when everything they thought they knew about themselves was tested and often broken. What remains are the stories, the histories, the photographs and films and memorials, and the ruins themselves, which Berlin has slowly transformed from symbols of destruction into symbols of remembrance. The battle for Berlin lasted 16 days. It killed roughly 400,000 people. It destroyed a city. It ended a war that had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million human beings worldwide. And when it was over, when the guns finally fell silent and the survivors emerged from cellars and rubble to survey what remained, the question that hung in the air was not who won, but rather what have we done? Because in the ruins of Berlin, in the faces of the dead and the eyes of the survivors, in the smoldering wreckage of a civilization that had consumed itself, there was no victory. There was only ending, only aftermath, only the terrible accounting of what humans are capable of doing to each other when ideology overrides empathy and power overrides conscience. Zhukov survived the war. He returned to his village to find his parents had died during the occupation, his father shot as a partisan suspect, his mother dead from starvation the following winter. His sister had survived. She was 19 years old and looked 50. He worked for 30 years as a mechanic. He married, had children, became a grandfather. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he gave brief answers and changed the subject. The memories were locked away, buried as deeply as the bodies in Berlin's mass graves. He died in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall fell. His last words to his grandson were about the war, the first time he had really spoken of it in decades. We thought we were fighting for something, he said, for the motherland, for revenge, for victory. But when it was over, when we stood in the ruins of Berlin and counted what it had cost, we realized we had just fought, that was all. The reasons didn't matter anymore. The reasons died with the millions who never came home. He closed his eyes then. An hour later, he was gone. Berlin today is a city of memorials. Plaques mark where battles were fought. Preserved ruins remind visitors of what was lost. The Holocaust Memorial stands near where the Führer bunker once was. 2,711 concrete slabs arranged in a grid, like a graveyard, like the streets of the ruined city, like the endless ranks of the dead. Tourists walk through these spaces with cameras and guidebooks. They cannot truly understand. None of us who were not there can. We can only read the histories, look at the photographs, try to imagine what it must have been like when a city of 3 million became a battlefield and civilization collapsed into ash. The veterans who survived carried their trauma in silence mostly. Soviet veterans were told not to speak of defeats or atrocities. German veterans were told not to speak at all. The stories were buried with the bodies, locked away with the guilt and the grief and the memory of what they had seen and done. But some stories survived. Some veterans late in life finally spoke. Historians collected their testimonies. Archives were opened. The truth, incomplete and contested, slowly emerged. What we learned is this: war is not glorious. Victory is not clean. The cost is always higher than anyone imagines. And the price is paid not just by soldiers but by civilians. Not just by the guilty but by the innocent. Not just in the moment but for generations afterward. Berlin fell in April 1945. The Third Reich collapsed. The war in Europe ended. Millions of soldiers went home to countries that no longer existed. existed in the form they remembered, to families that had been shattered, to lives that could never be the same. And in the ruins of the city, in the silence after the gunfire, in the emptiness left by 400,000 dead, there was only one truth that mattered. History remembers the victors. But the ground remembers everyone. You've witnessed the final collapse of Berlin, the desperate defense of an indefensible position, the overwhelming Soviet assault, the civilian tragedy, and the hollow victory paid for in hundreds of thousands of lives. The German soldiers fought for a regime that had betrayed them. The Soviet soldiers fought for vengeance and homeland, but committed atrocities in victory. The civilians were trapped between two armies, guilty by association or simply by geography, paying the price for a war they didn't start but couldn't stop. So we ask you this. In a battle where both sides lost their humanity in the pursuit of victory, where civilians paid the highest price for leaders' ambitions, and where the cost of winning exceeded any possible value of the prize, was Berlin a victory at all, or just the final chapter of a tragedy that destroyed everyone it touched?